thanks so much to you for coming instead of taking a post-lunch nap. I understand the temptation, though. And thanks also to Peter and Emmanuel for inviting me, and to Trada and Kit for helping with all of the logistics. It's really a pleasure to be here as part of such a truly interdisciplinary group, as opposed to just like lawyers and economists talking about sovereign debt or something like that. So that's great. So today I'm speaking about a piece tentatively titled Sovereign Debt, Private Wealth, Vultures, Thieves, and the Contingency of Legal Strategy, though I'm definitely open to recommendations on that front. This project is still at a fairly early stage, and I thought I'd speak today a little bit about where the project came from, and then provide an overview of some of the key elements and where I think it might go. So the paper is in some ways a return to themes in my first book, kind of drawing away from some of the stuff I've been doing more recently. My first book looked at the treatment of sovereign or country debt after political regime changes in modern finance. And the book connected to my broader interest in how the narratives about and the lines between the public and the private are drawn in the global financial arena. And part of what I looked at was how that line is not very well respected in modern practices of lending to sovereign states. So investors have lent to ostensibly public or sovereign entities without paying very much attention to the sovereign character or the particularly public character of the borrowing. For example, by paying attention to things like the local laws or the constitutional order that is supposed to be constitutive of the public sovereign itself, right? To relations of internal authority, questions of public benefit, that kind of thing. So in writing the book, I was interested in something else, though I didn't have a chance to get into it. And that was the way in which the international financial worlds of sovereign debt and private wealth or personal wealth or private wealth management, right, can involve the very same individuals, right? On the one hand, they're acting as agents for governments in sovereign debt contracts and other types of investment contracts, but they might also be private clients for various financial firms and law firms, right? So that range of kind of service providers in the global arena. And of course, the two transactions can also implicate the very same funds, right? Borrowed in the name of a sovereign government for which the sovereign government is responsible, but then appropriated by corrupt individuals sort of in charge of the sovereign regime, and then invested as personal wealth, right? And on the private client or the private wealth side of banking, right, often within the same bank, there's been a careful attentiveness to sort of policing the boundaries of the private, right? So you have on the one side, the sovereign lending going, oh, well, it's a little fuzzy, but everyone knows it's a little fuzzy, no big deal. Why get too worked up about that? And then on the private bank side, sometimes within the same bank, well, this is the private. We have to very strictly draw the boundaries. That's the entire foundation for international finance, right? So you have this kind of duality going on that was interesting to me. So I wondered about the degree to which this separation or tension or inconsistency can and should be thought of as inevitable, right? How are the lines drawn between public entities like countries and municipalities and the powerful private individuals that are running them on the one hand? How does this connect to non-natural entities like corporations or trusts or foundations, right? These sort of constructed structures that can obscure financial flows and then construct or reify them as private, right? Does the line drawing differ across various areas of transnational economic activity across time? And how have the players involved conceived of or used this kind of ambiguity? And historically, how did private wealth diverge from the system of sovereign finance, especially given that much sovereign finance was originally both state and personal finance, banking at the same time? So I have this sort of broader vision or project in the back of my mind, which I'm thinking of as sort of the second book project, constructing private wealth, I don't think something like that. But I wanted to find a kind of more biteable chunk to start with and start working with. And one way in which some of these themes and potential tensions can emerge is through the practice of debt collection and asset recovery, okay? So when sovereign debtors fail to repay, how do creditors actually try to collect? And particularly for the themes that I'm interested in, to what degree do they try to collect against the ostensibly private assets of sovereign individuals, right, or of sovereign officials? And I noticed that certain vulture funds, and I'll define and talk about that shortly, or distressed debt funds in the international arena, are doing kind of interesting things with debt collection. In particular, we've seen several cases recently where these funds, these creditors, have started to expose and exploit the entanglements between sovereign debt and ostensibly private wealth in their asset recovery efforts. And so this is the sub-project I'm interested in talking about today. So first, some kind of preliminary comments about narrative and law, kind of building into the themes of the conference as a whole. This is not unique to me, but you can think about legal strategy or legal argument as a type of narrative, right? Or at least the best and the most successful legal strategies are often a type of kind of highly compelling, very sort of focused narrative, right? There are often characters, or even if it's just financial flows, you construct them, right, as characters, protagonists and villains, a story arc with moral implications, and some degree of closure, ideally, right? Or at least you're trying to encourage closure on this. And if you construct a narrative well, and also carefully shape it within the discursive parameters of legal rules and expectations, you can put yourself in a better situation for the purposes of furthering your argument, right? This is certainly and more obviously true for something like a trial, right, which is obviously kind of a story arc. But I think of it as also true for what might be understood as a broader or kind of macro legal strategy, such as multiple connected efforts across multiple jurisdictions over time to collect on the assets of a sovereign debtor. Right? So you can think of that as a broad strategy and narrative as well. And so one of the overall arguments I'm interested in making is that looking more closely at these debt collection efforts offers several insights. So first, we sometimes imagine legal strategy and the narrative in which it's embedded as just kind of arising from the mind of clever lawyers. And this is partially true, and in fact, the asset collection strategies I'm focused on really are primarily about this one unusually aggressive hedge fund group, Elliott Management, if anyone is interested. But still, if you look closely, the narratives and the strategy itself also is enabled by or grounded in the material and normative context of a particular moment, right? So there's an important element of historical contingency in this legal strategy and in the narratives in which they're embedded, okay? So second, and relatedly, this recovery approach, I think, sheds light on some interesting and underappreciated tensions within international finance that I'm interested in, both within the banking establishment and also in the arguments that are made by the creditors themselves. And finally, I think looking at this more closely has important ramifications for thinking through possible reform efforts in the international system. So I'm happy to talk more about that if anyone is interested. So just sort of like preliminarily, a couple terms or definitions. So vulture funds is a term that's used for a subset of distressed debt investors, okay? So these investors work by purchasing distressed debt on the secondary market, so they're not the original lenders, but the original lenders have decided, look, I want to get out of this, I'm not interested in doing this anymore. Will someone buy the right to collect on the debt, right? So this is the secondary market, and these distressed debt investors purchase on the secondary market, generally at a deep discount. When the countries are in trouble, other creditors are trying to get out, and so you can buy the debt, buy the sort of right to collect this debt for very cheap, okay? But then these vulture funds, unlike some other investors, including distressed debt investors, instead of participating in the debt restructuring collectively with everyone else, they hold out for a better deal, usually suing for the debt's full value, and then collecting assets wherever they can find them, right? Or pressuring and embarrassing countries into a favorable settlement. So that's sort of the strategy and what's distinguishing, I think, of vulture funds from other types of investors. So some of the tactics they have used, which you might have come across if you're looking at some of the newspapers about this, you know, seizing a naval ship with all of the naval trainees on board, trying to claim a country's currency reserves in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, intercepting aid payments designated for the country, right? So they are really aggressive. They'll look anywhere and claim the broadest possible range of assets as recoverable, including, and this is the thing I'm interested in, arguably the personal or personally controlled wealth of the leaders involved, okay? So I do want to highlight these holdout creditors are unusual. So even within holdout litigation, this more personalized approach is also unusual. But I think it's important because the threat of such litigation can sort of reshape what's considered appropriate, what's considered possible for the debtors in terms of their willingness to capitulate to these countries. And also, I think, just as sort of an empirical methodological point, studying the exception can shed some light on what's going on in the larger number of cases that no one is noticing and that remain hidden away, right? So I'd like to just sort of introduce a quick historical snapshot that I think provides an interesting spin on where we are now. So it can seem commonplace today that a country's wealth and a creditor's claim to that wealth is separate from the personal wealth of an individual ruler or head of state, right? Of course, though, this has not always been the case. So just like a fun example, at the dawn of the 100 Years' War, so King Edward III of England showed up in Flanders with insufficient funds for his military ambitions, okay? So he turned to private creditors on the continent for financing. And as an inducement to give them, to convince them to lend him money, he offered as collateral, right? So if I don't pay you back, you can seize this, right? He offered all of his jewels, the jewels of his wife, his lesser crowns, his war horse, the great crown of his grandfather, Edward I, right? So he was unable to pay, so the creditors seized the great crown and also seized some of his relatives who had personally guaranteed the debt. I think at least one cousin was held hostage for 3 months, so personal guarantee meant something totally different back in the day, right? So, you know, maybe this is not surprising in eras of personalistic rule, right, in which the sovereign is at once a state and an earthly kind of mortal individual. The mechanisms and the benefits of control, and also the final personal responsibility, all ultimately rested with one individual, or at least one family, okay? But what this kind of episode underscores is the degree to which the benefits and the risks of effectively unfettered sovereign rule were joined together, right? A family might enrich itself with the treasures of the land, but those personal benefits and the individually enjoyed luxuries, right, were also at risk if things went awry, okay? Today, what is interesting is that these two elements seem to have been disconnected, right? In some countries, you can enrich yourself with the treasure of the land, live virtually with the luxuries of an absolute monarch of old, but the construction or the narration of the realm of private wealth and global finance has meant that you are then insulated from the problems and the risks of the sovereign state itself. So the benefit and the risk of those older forms of sovereign rule have been unlinked by virtue of sort of the norms and the narratives of global finance and sovereign debt today. So what is interesting to me about the Vulture Fund strategy is that it sort of targets this intersection, and in some ways is re-injecting an element of risk here, right? So I just want to sort of mention a couple cases here: Congo, Brazzaville, and Argentina. So these are the sort of two big cases where some stuff like this has happened. So first, this is the Republic of Congo, with its capital at Brazzaville, is one of these countries with a fair amount of natural wealth, particularly oil wealth in that case, but relatively little sort of governmental and economic capacity, right, compared to where you think they should be. Incidentally, not to be confused with DRC, sort of Congo-Kinshasa, which is even more wealthy and even more troubled, right, its neighbor. So like many other countries in the 1980s, Congo weathered a crisis in which it defaulted on its debt. So eventually a vulture fund called Kensington International, which is part of this vulture fund group, purchased the debt on the secondary market, presumably at a deep discount, though they don't tend to tell us exactly what they're doing. And starting in the 1990s, this is during the Congolese Civil War, they started requesting of, I guess, all of the people claiming to control the government that the debt be repaid, right? Eventually it sued in English courts, and it received a judgment that the debt was owed, and Congo still didn't pay, in part because they were still fighting. It was not clear who was supposed to be in charge. And then Kensington started trying to seize Congolese assets really in the early 2000s. As part of this, right, and they do impressive detective work, really, they uncovered a series of shell companies that potentially had a dual purpose. So first, these shell companies could obscure the flow of Congolese oil assets, which might have hidden payments for oil from creditors like Kensington, right? So if you can run this through shell companies, then maybe the creditors won't say, oh, this is Congolese oil, and be able to seize it, right? But also, these embedded and interlocking hidden kind of shell companies also provided a mechanism to quietly drain away some of those funds without anyone noticing internally as well, right? So these funds sort of discovered and publicized this element with glee, right? And of course also highlighted that some of these related shell companies appeared to be paying for the personal expenses of high officials and presidential family members, right? Often one and the same. The high officials and the family members were often the same people. And this is all, incidentally, while Congo was arguing in favor of debt relief at the UN. So that kind of messed up with the optics of the debt relief when simultaneously they were like, well, 500,000 euros was also spent on clothes for the first son, right? But anyway, so that was kind of interesting stuff going on there. So the second case I look at is Argentina. And so Argentina, of course, unless you've been under a rock, you probably know they defaulted on this huge amount of debt, right? It was $100 billion in 2001, undoubtedly the most spectacular default in global history, right? Brought about by a serious depression and in a political time that was just so awful and so troubled that the country cycled through 5 presidents in 2 weeks. So eventually they ended up restructuring most of this debt through 2 exchanges in 2005 and 2010. But a number of vulture funds, in particular NML Capital, purchased this debt on the secondary market and started suing for the full amount again. So the twists and turns and the contact interpretation details that are going on in New York courts are very well covered, but one of the collection efforts that has been basically overlooked is what I'm interested in. So a journalist in Argentina had revealed that associates of the Kirchner political family had established shell companies in Nevada and had allegedly siphoned away some of the funds through these shell companies. So NML jumped all over this, obtaining discovery into the companies, revealing that they were linked to Mossack Fonseca, which is the law firm in Panama that was at the center of the Panama Papers, and so a range of these types of activities throughout the world. And so NML did its best to sort of publicize this globally and kind of enhance the atmosphere of Argentine intransigence that it was cultivating overall, sort of like macro legal strategy narrative that ended up being incredibly successful and lucrative for that vulture fund. Ultimately, there's just sort of like a huge deadlock in New York courts. There was a change of administration, and the new administration decided to settle with these funds, in part simultaneously putting out new debt in the international markets, which it has now just recently gone back to the IMF, acknowledging that it's having trouble repaying. So it's this like terrible cycle here. So one question that these cases raise for me is, why now, right? Why do we have the emergence of this macro strategy relatively more recently? What accounts for this personalized turn in asset recovery? At the edges, why do some creditors adopt this kind of narrative while other creditors don't, right? And how is it that this arguably private wealth has become plausible for asset recovery? Again, sometimes we'll think of legal strategy as being the function of creative lawyers, and that's true, but it's hardly the whole story, right? The history of sovereign debt includes large numbers of profligate political elites who saddle their countries with debt and then make away with the proceeds. And then in modern finance, creditors seem not to have generally attacked this kind of potential source of wealth, right? So I provide no definitive answer here. I don't want to make a strong causal claim. But I do want to suggest that looking more closely at the underlying material structures and some of the ideational or normative context for sovereign lending and for private wealth can provide some insight into sort of the structures that support a type of legal strategy and narrative. Right? So let's start with the material side. So I focused on vulture funds so far, but they're hardly the only entities involved in sovereign debt. Right? Other creditors, especially historically, included some of these major international banks. And many of these banks have both sovereign lending departments and private client services. So you can imagine that this puts them on both sides sometimes of the sovereign debt private wealth equation, right? And you can also imagine how this might make them more ambivalent about the most aggressive, most personalized asset recovery and the most sort of like challenging narrative that would be associated with it, right? Because you could otherwise be in an awkward situation in which the sovereign debt group in a bank, in an effort to collect stolen assets, right, depending on your perspective, to satisfy a debt claim, ends up effectively trying to sue or uncover the assets hidden away in the private wealth side of the bank, the same bank, right? So it might make more sense for that hypothetical bank to work harder at restructuring the debt, right? Even if it's not like a full recovery, it could still provide a respectable return, kick the can down the road, and then retain the sort of relationship that's being maintained with two clients that are potentially actually the same person, but are technically, legally, two separate clients, right? So this double-sided element, I think, can help to account for some of the variation across creditors in a given situation. So one of the things that I thought was interesting in looking at the Kensington-Congo case is that Kensington, the Vulture Fund, found Congo intransigent, its leaders worthy of scorn, all that kind of stuff. But some of the creditors actually considered the country a shining beacon of hope in the shadow cast by Argentina because they were actually trying to work with the creditors in general. In particular, the French bank BNP Paribas played a key role in Congo's restructuring. And BNP Paribas has a history with both Congo-Brazzaville and also its ruling family. So for the country, its sovereign debt department has put together syndicated loans, led restructuring efforts, also helped to arrange some pre-financing deals that people have thought problematic. But it seems that the bank also has a relationship with the ruling family, allegedly holding private bank accounts, facilitating the purchase of luxury real estate that has earned the ire of the French anti-bribery authorities, right? So these dynamics could also help us understand why this kind of asset recovery has also emerged only relatively recently. So, you know, there have been lots of cases in which creditors might have liked to seize arguably corrupt assets. You can think of, you know, Iran, Philippines, Nicaragua, a whole bunch of situations, but it hasn't happened. And one factor in the story is that the sovereign debt regime from World War II until the 1990s, and kind of this fits into my interest in international economic history in general, was generally organized through these types of major banks, right? Like Chase, like BNP Paribas. Hedge funds, these types of independent investor funds, were not heavily involved in this earlier period. And so these banks, to the extent that you had kind of relationship with both the sovereign and the ruling elite, you know, are trapped on both sides potentially, right? But that, of course, only explains the discretion of any given bank, right, that might have had interests in both private wealth and sovereign debt in a particular country case, right? What about all the other creditors, right? What held them back? So I think this, too, could have something to do with the structure of credit markets, right? So the sort of material structure giving rise to or limiting the ability of certain kind of legal strategies to emerge, right? So currently, bonds are the dominant borrowing mechanism, right, in sovereign debt. These bonds are highly liquid, held by lots of investors. They don't know each other. They don't care about each other, right? So it's sort of a right time to try to do an asset recovery strategy that depends upon screwing over everyone else, which is effectively what they're doing. But between the sort of World War II and 1990s, the sovereign lending was based in banks, and these banks were not just potentially on both sides of sovereign debt and private wealth, so there wasn't that kind of enmeshing. They were also enmeshed with each other also, right? They were enmeshed with each other through things like loan syndications, in which banks held participations in loans organized by other banks, okay? And so this created something of an oligopoly, right? Where even if you might have been interested in going after a particular ruler, right, for a particular debt, because you were enmeshed in this sort of broader network, you wouldn't actually do it, because if you did it here, then they're going to do it there, and the whole thing ends up falling apart, right? So there's a sort of like network effect here. So that's sort of like a range of the material factors, I think, had an impact, right, in sort of like thinking about the ground for narratives or legal strategies to develop. But I think that's not the only thing that's going on. There's also, I think, an ideational factor that might impact this question or have something to say about this. Historically, the financial institutions focused on private wealth management were very careful to protect the boundaries of the personal, right? So the fact that a private banking client might have held high public office or had significant access to arguably stolen money was not really a problem, right? And the presentation seems to have been, well, is it really stolen if the individual basically runs the country at will, even if they do it through these unsavory ways, right? Nonetheless, so they weren't saying that, but that seems to have been in the background. In general, they were being very quiet, and this is, you know, bank secrecy was central to all of this. So Switzerland is probably the most famous for this. For example, it criminalized the release of private bank information or account identities in 1934, but other offshore jurisdictions, to the extent that they wanted to compete, basically ended up following, right? And it wasn't just the banks, of course. There was a more laissez-faire attitude to corruption generally, right? There's a nice quote from the New York State Court of Appeals that was dismissing a case brought by the post-revolutionary government in Iran in 1979 that was trying to attempt to recover assets from the deposed Shah. And the court basically says, look, one, we don't want to deal with this. This is going to be a huge administrative burden on New York courts. But also, can a foreign absolute monarch really be held responsible for benefiting from absolute rule, right? Do we want to be in position of saying that, right? So they basically kind of end up adopting that position. Of course, starting in the 1990s, again, there have been important shifts, right? Sort of with the end of the Cold War, there's a greater concern with clean government, a range of international, regional, and also national level laws that are trying to deal with that. And this sort of encouraged and resonated with greater anger within the countries at instances of high-level corruption that ended up being publicized. So people started to view this more openly and vocally as deeply problematic. And so this shift made political elites more sensitive and then more vulnerable to attack and embarrassment on these grounds from entities like vulture funds, right? So of course it's potentially good, but on the other hand, to the extent that these elites think that it's problematic that this language is being thrown about with regard to them, they're more likely to settle early rather than suffer the embarrassment of having to deal with all this. So it's kind of like a weird thing here. So the normative change, interestingly, happened even though it's unclear that corruption has really waned at all. So you still have the flow of funds, right? But you have the normative shift that actually potentially makes a settlement more likely in kind of an interesting way. So it's really not a bad time to be a vulture fund if you are interested in this. I teach bankruptcy and debtor-creditor relations, and every once in a while I get students that are like, oh, I'm really interested in distressed debt investing. I'm like, no. They're like, wow, it seems really lucrative. I'm like, that was not really the point. But, yeah. I mean, it's also, it's kind of interesting to think about the historical contingency of this strategy. But I do want to just point out quickly that there's also inconsistency in the vulture fund strategy and in the stories and the narratives that they are telling to further their interests, right? On the one hand, they're attempting to uncover these assets that they're claiming are sovereign assets inaccurately claimed as private assets by saying, you know, corruption, this is terrible, like a bad regime, this is unacceptable. But it's virtually certain that some portion of the sovereign debt was borrowed under questionable circumstances by corrupt elites violating a range of internal laws as well, right? And of course, they probably would have known this, or most certainly would have known this, purchasing from a regime, you know, purchasing debt on the secondary market in the midst of a civil war and huge corruption scandals, right? The idea that they did, oh, I didn't know that the original debt was tainted. It's like, then you are somehow simultaneously brilliant and an idiot. I mean, it's just implausible. And they're still insisting on complete repayment. So for a range of kind of like technical legal matters, it is difficult to make that argument in court. But of course, their argument is not purely a technical legal argument. It is also embedded in this kind of political, moral strategy narrative where they're trying to argue in courts, but they're also trying to embarrass to the point of success, right? So there's this kind of interesting thing going on. So I don't want to go on too long, but I just sort of will flag that vulture fund is not the most complimentary term, and they don't like it. And I don't. I mean, you feel like maybe they could just like adopt it as just like, yeah, I'm a vulture. I play an important role in we were talking about bioeconomics and the bioeconomic ecosystem, right? But they don't like it. And I am among the many people who think that they do play an incredibly problematic role in the international economy. But looking at this debt collection strategy, there's something to admire in it, right? They're sort of providing some kind of a service. And, you know, it's interesting because they're touching upon two legal regimes and two narratives that deal with financial flows, right? Asset recovery and illicit capital movements on the one hand, and sovereign debt on the other. So on the asset recovery side, there's been a ton of frustration about the slow pace of actually recovering assets from corrupt officials, right? Despite all these efforts, the returned assets are very low. In part due to these sort of norms and protective laws of private banking and private wealth and how that has developed over time. So there's some range of scholars, including probably the best known is Jason Sharman, who's a political science at Cambridge University, who focuses on asset recovery and says, well, maybe what we should do is just basically like deputize the vulture funds. They're having so much more success than anyone else in actually recovering assets. Now, the assets don't go to the underlying population. The primary guy that probably makes the most money out of this is Paul Singer, who lives in Greenwich, Connecticut, and donates a ton of money to the Republican Party. I mean, it has an amazing Warhol collection, apparently. Okay, but at least it's potentially providing a deterrent effect, right? So he says, well, maybe that's enough. So this is interesting and intriguing, but I think it really is only looking at one side of this, right? Because the vulture fund strategy and the incentive depends upon a deeply flawed debt restructuring regime more generally, and in particular, the absence of a collective process like sovereign bankruptcy, which would be problematic in some ways, but would at least force everyone to the table, right? And so I'm worried that encouraging this kind of activity would require maintaining the current approach and sort of strengthening the actors that depend on approach. So, you know, this sort of invites people, I think, to ask, are there more, collective alternative ways of thinking about this? Is sort of like joining the two sides together. So one way, I'm happy to talk about policy proposals later if people want to, but can you include a sort of collective asset recovery thing in the bonds themselves, in the loan contracts? Like that may be one thing to do, right? Second, could asset recovery projects be more explicitly incorporated into sovereign bankruptcy proposals? They haven't been there yet, but domestic bankruptcy does include asset recovery possibilities and procedures, so is that something that could be done? I think for thinking about either of these things, and especially the sovereign bankruptcy proposal, what would be the political impact, the practical impact of actually incorporating that too, right? Because it's true that, notwithstanding the fact that many of these countries are deeply corrupt, the people are also suffering, and so you want them to take advantage of these types of collective provisions, right? But if you included this, right, on the one hand, asset recovery measures there would be some greater recovery for creditors, but potentially less in the austerity measures that are so problematic in a lot of sovereign debt restructurings. But it might also make sovereign debtor elites less likely to actually use a sovereign bankruptcy process, right? If they feel that they themselves or their allies might eventually be the target of these types of recovery actions, right? And then sort of relatedly, if I'm presenting this to a law audience, what would be the ethics of lawyers advising sovereign debtors about what's likely to happen if they were to take advantage of such a regime, right? I mean, so there's sort of like a range of things there that suggest, I think, there's much more work to be done and much more to be said at this sort of intersection of sovereign debt and private wealth. Try to figure out a little bit more. So thanks so much.